Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Lawyers Weekly show, brought to you in partnership with our good friends at LexisNexis, who've been long-time supporters of Lawyers Weekly and of this show. And so we're very grateful to them for partnering with us once again. I'm joined for this conversation by Lindsay O'Connor, who is the head of online solutions at LexisNexis. She's joining me today from Auckland, and she's sitting across from me on the screen, and I from her. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jerome. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
It's a pleasure to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the pain points around legal drafting, particularly some things that have been noticed over the past 18 months since the onset of the pandemic. From there, we'll delve into the increasing importance of legal tech and what it might mean to be a successful lawyer with regards to drafting and tech as we move forward into the post-pandemic market. There's a lot to talk about here, Lindsay. So let's dive right in. I'm curious to know, from your perspective, from the perspective of LexisNexis, what might be some of the headline pain points and challenges that are being encountered with regards to legal drafting at this point in time, and have some of these pain points been really exacerbated by the age of coronavirus?
I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually, Jerome. I think it's important for us to note that many of these pain points around legal drafting were actually present before the pandemic. And certainly as lawyers have transitioned to working from home, that's definitely exacerbated some of these issues. So, many of our listeners will be familiar with what some of these issues are because they will encounter them on a daily basis. I think some of the key ones that spring to mind for me are certainly around version control. So often when you're preparing a legal document, there can be many different versions of that passed around between different solicitors, whether it's going to a legal assistant, a paralegal, or off to a secretary for checking as well. And so keeping on track of what the latest version is really important. That's particularly important when you bear in mind where a lawyer might be getting that document from in the first place. So certainly from our research, we found that when a lawyer needs to draft a document, they're going to one of a few different places. They're either going to go to their firm's precedent database, if they're fortunate enough to have one, great starting place. But if they don't have that, they're often reusing an old document that they may have drafted in the past. And you can see there that there's some really serious potential issues. If a lawyer actually leaves in some old information, an old client's name, company name, amount or date, that can be quite embarrassing if it's sent across to the other side or sent on to a client. I think when lawyers were in an office situation, a lot of this kind of review work, proofreading work was actually done in person. So we certainly hear from a lot of our customers that even some partners were still marking things up by hand with the old school way and kind of handing that off to sort of a junior lawyer to make the changes or across to their secretary, not fully utilizing sort of digital tools there. Obviously, when everybody moved to working from home early last year, that couldn't happen anymore. So suddenly you had everybody moving to an environment where they were having to collaborate digitally and online. And I think we just found that there were different levels of competency and comfort with that. Some people adapted really quickly and actually found that it was a much more efficient way to draft. Other people, there was a bit of upskilling involved there and learning how to use the tools, if indeed their firm had the tools. So I think what we've seen is the last 18 months just have really brought to the forefront what some of those issues are. And we now have the full spectrum of people who are actually excelling, thriving, and are more efficient than ever. And some people who are potentially still a little behind in terms of adopting that technology.
What's really interesting to me listening to you outline some of those challenges, Lindsay, is that what you're describing, they're not issues of competency or knowledge about the law. They're sort of on the ground, basic practical issues. The last one you were just listing there, is just the idea that, not many people have a printer at home. And so if you're used to, marking things up by hand with a pen and a highlighter in the office, and you're suddenly not able to do that while you're working from your dining room table, that's a whole new way of absorbing documentation that you have to get used to overnight, that, would be quite difficult for some people. I personally like to print off stuff and read it like that when I can. Mostly though because I want to reduce my time on screens. But then with the first issue you outlined, the idea of not being able to access a shared drive in the office or a firm intranet. And so, the latest version of a document may be sort of lost in translation for different professionals. These sound like issues that are not, they sound like issues that can be overcome, but until someone points it out, it could easily be missed.
Absolutely. And, the concern is that we really want lawyers to be lawyers. They excel at knowing the law, dealing with their clients, giving people advice. And what we're really asking them to do here a lot of the time with drafting is, as you say, work with some fairly practical issues, which isn't really where their time is best spent. We want them to focus on the advisory work, which is where looking at what kind of technology options are available to kind of help you improve the efficiency of documentation drafting, reviewing documentation is so important, because then they can actually spend their time where it's best used in accordance with their expertise.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly get into some of those tech solutions or practical steps that can be taken. But I wanted to ask, further to the question about some of those challenges that are being experienced. Are you finding that these are pretty commonplace across the board? That maybe firms or practices or law departments of all stripes are experiencing some of these, shall we say, administrative hurdles, or is it perhaps limited to certain pockets of the profession?
I think what surprised me is that you have people at every stage of this journey. So, we've got some people who definitely are really struggling with, transitioning to working in this way. And to be honest, they're probably a little bit reluctant to talk about that. There's an element of not wanting to necessarily reach out for help. They just feel like they sort of should be able to deal with something that they haven't been trained to do. Then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have some firms who have really just thrown themselves into and almost have the opposite problem. They kind of felt that technology could solve all their issues and started to adopt a large number of different programs and tools, and they've almost had kind of system overload for their users. People now aren't sure what they're meant to be using when, and you have people within a firm at various levels of expertise and experience with how to use those things. So I think what's surprising is that we absolutely can't treat the profession as a whole in this area. We have a full range of people who have almost created issues for themselves with making things a little bit too complicated, right from people who are just still trying to make do in a kind of analog world where things have moved digitally now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tell me a bit more about that sort of tech overload that you were just referring to there. Because I can certainly understand why if you've got too many systems in front of you, then it might seem too overwhelming, and in an already turbulent and uncertain time, you may just want to revert to the simplest option, which is perhaps pen and paper or something else that might be a bit more outdated now, and so you might reject that sort of tech suite entirely. Is there a sort of sweet spot somewhere in the middle for lawyers and for firms, do you think, or is it going to be case by case?
I think to an extent it's case by case, but I think you do need to achieve an element of balance here. I think some firms really tried to meet the problem head on. We were thrown into this situation last year where everybody had to work from home, probably a little bit before the legal profession was ready for that way of working. And so people, being innovative, as most lawyers are, they are problem solvers. They tried to look to what was available to solve this problem. And, one of those solutions is tech. And there's a huge number of tools out there. So we found lots of firms adapting things like Slack. They were utilizing Teams, but they were also utilizing Zoom. And what you then find is users actually aren't sure what tool they're meant to be using at what stage. They've got a chat going on in Slack and another chat going on in Teams. They're getting calls from Teams, calls via Zoom, and it's actually just wasting a lot of their time jumping between all of these different programs. If it's a program you don't use every day, there's also that upskilling. When you log on to it for the first time in a couple of weeks, you're like, well, where's the button for this? And it sort of slows down your actual progress. So you don't want to be doing that. What we want to have is seamless integration, so that when people do switch between different programs or applications, there's no upskilling phase during that. They're able to seamlessly move across and just integrate it into their existing kind of process that they have. So I think that is the sweet spot. And that's going to be a little bit different for every firm, right? Some people are going to be able to integrate a lot of different tools into that process. And for some people, they should really just cut that back and simplify it right back to basics.
How urgent a priority is this integration? At this point in time, as of the date of recording, we're obviously not out of the pandemic just yet. The vaccine rollout is going well in Australia, but we're not quite out of the woods just yet. And so, lawyers are still in a position whereby they're trying to keep their clients' heads above water, with their own businesses. If you're a partner or a leader within a law firm, perhaps you're trying to keep your own business afloat. And so there's so many different things that you have to worry about, in the day-to-day. So where in the triage should integration sit in terms of, urgent priorities?
I think it's super urgent for firms to consider now, because we're actually, for me, reaching a point in the sort of pandemic, which is going to be even more tricky for firms to manage. When everybody had to work from home, everybody was in the same boat. So we were dealing with sort of one group of people, everybody at home experiencing similar issues. What we're going to find now is people slowly returning to the office. And I think that it's clear to see, not just within the legal profession, but within other professions, that not everybody is going to return to the office, and not everybody's going to return to the office on as regular a basis as prior to the pandemic. So what we're going to have now is different groups of users. You're going to have people who are there present within a firm, face-to-face, dealing with one another. And then they're going to also be working with people who are working entirely remotely. So that's going to create a kind of, two-tier sort of system for firms to deal with. So integrating technology now, before firms start to encounter that issue, is going to be a really good idea, because it enables people to just make that the default scenario, so that even when they return to the office, they're able to still use those kind of technological processes to manage particularly things like producing documents.
Well, I'd probably add a third tier of users to that argument, Lindsay, and saying that, yes, there will be some who go back to the office. Yes, there will be some who remain at home, but there's probably going to be a certain group in the middle that might do, like a 60-40 arrangement. And so they're using, the office systems and whatever's set up at home. And so, for an employer, for a business to try to accommodate all of those idiosyncrasies is, as you rightly say, that's going to be an incredibly onerous, burdensome administrative process.
Even for me today, Jerome, I've come into the office to record this today, and it's taken me a good 10 minutes just to set up my screens and microphone and headset and everything. And I work in tech. So, people are potentially going to be dealing with that on a daily basis when they have that kind of split working.
Do you think that law firms, in-house teams are cognizant of this looming danger, shall we say? Are they, awake to the, hang on, I'll start that again. Do you think that law firms, of all shapes and sizes, law departments of all stripes are aware of this looming danger that we're talking about, that they're really going to have to get their integration up to speed urgently if they're to successfully navigate, the looming post-pandemic market?
The concern for me is I hear people talking about going back to normal. And for me, that's kind of a thought process that things in the future are going to go back to being like they were prior to the pandemic. And actually for me, that won't be the case. And that shouldn't be the case, because I think in the past 18 months, we've all learned a lot of new tools, a lot of new techniques. And for me, the biggest opportunity is to embrace that moving forward, even when we do return to the office, not to go back to how we were doing things 18 months ago, but to really embrace those changes and some of the efficiency gains that they've kind of brought to firms.
Yeah, well, speaking of efficiency, I wanted to ask, and there might be a very obvious answer to this question, but what do you see as being the biggest dangers in not, bringing your integration up to speed for this new normal? Are there going to be massive inefficiencies, with the processing of client matters? Any sort of financial considerations for firms? What are the big dangers moving forward if these issues aren't addressed?
I think the key pressure for firms at the moment is that there's obviously a continuing pressure for firms to grow at a time when demand for legal services is remaining relatively flat. So that means in order to sort of increase profitability and increase margins, the only way that firms are really going to be able to do that is to kind of increase that margin on their existing revenue streams. And that means becoming more efficient. Essentially. We're also seeing firms increasingly offer fixed fee work. So obviously, if you're offering that to your clients as an option, you want to make sure that you're as efficient as possible. So you want to make sure that those efficient processes are in place before you start to offer that kind of fixed fee work. Otherwise, you can actually find that your margins are shrinking at a time that firms really need them to be growing.
Are there any other, sort of, I suppose, upheavals to what we might understand to be traditional legal service delivery that law firms can and should be looking at? Obviously, movement from billable hours to fixed fees is quite a big step for certain practitioners to wrap their heads around. But are there any other transitions that might be hard to shake, but firms really should be considering?
There's all kinds of interesting ways in the way in which clients are sort of briefing firms now, and at what point in the process I think people are briefing law firms. Previously, a lawyer used to be engaged, very early on in that process. So they were across the entire matter right from the beginning. What we're finding, particularly with in-house legal teams, is that there's often a desire for them to try and keep as much work in-house as possible. And so what that means in practice is often a sort of half-finished piece of work is being handed across to their external law firms to sort of pick up something that's already been set in place, or to just do a particular part of that legal matter. So for example, it might be just drafting the end document when they haven't actually been involved in any of the preliminary discussions. So I think that certainly a kind of necessitates a change to lawyers' skill sets, to not necessarily have ownership of a legal process from start to finish, but just to be able to pick up kind of pieces of that legal matter and deliver on them.
Just on that point of the in-house teams doing more of the work in-house and, perhaps not, collaborating as comprehensively as they could with their external firm providers. Is there perhaps a chicken and egg thing there whereby they might notice that law firm integration processes aren't up to scratch, and so they'll retain that work in-house so as not to, I suppose, penalize themselves, by working with a firm whose processes, that they're just not, that they just don't view favorably?
Absolutely. We found actually that in-house departments actually are some of the more innovative in the legal profession. I can just think of a few sort of people I've spoken to from that sector, and, they're really doing quite interesting, exciting things. We were talking to a lawyer here in New Zealand a few weeks ago who is actually, they're utilizing some sort of project management, product development methodologies in their in-house team, things like Kanban and Agile and design thinking, which is just really cool to see. But I would say that they're almost ahead of some of the law firms that they might be dealing with. So for sure, I think if you see that you have some more innovative processes, you're going to be a little bit more reluctant to potentially hand off work to somebody that doesn't also have those innovative processes in place.
Absolutely. Actually, hang on, sorry. Just give me a second. I had two questions in my mind. I want to figure out which one to ask first. Yeah. So Lindsay, in response to all of these concerns, these considerations, what do you see as being the main practical steps that can and should be taken by firms, by team leaders, not only to bring one's integration processes up to speed as quickly as possible, but also to imbibe a certain level of trust, with one's clients and with those in-house teams?
I think the first thing firms need to do before they do anything, I think there is a kind of a desire to just reach out and find something that's going to magically help you and just to jump straight into that. Before they do anything, I would really advise that they start with a thorough review of where they're at currently. So that involves doing some things that we do in the product world all the time, mapping out your existing processes. It sounds really boring, but if you get a team together, you can actually make it quite a sort of, exciting and fun process. Map out your existing ways of doing things. what tools are you utilizing? What are the sort of weak points of that process? Where do you think that there's scope for kind of improving? And then once you've done that, you can really map out the user cases for where you need help or where you think you can improve the efficiency. Then go and look for tools that are going to help you specifically with those pain points. That's going to avoid you adopting technology just for the sake of adopting technology, and mean that when you do adopt a kind of system to help you with that, it's really going to actually meet the pain points that you've identified in advance. And then do a kind of good review of what's out there in the market. I mean, there's more tech out there than ever before. You know, we're finding everything from really innovative legal tech startups to, of course, places like LexisNexis, where we've really been through a sort of evolution in the past few years from being a very traditional legal publisher to now sort of being at the forefront of some exciting technological developments. So there's a lot out there. You know, just do a review, see what's appropriate, and probably review a few different options before you decide which one you're going to go with.
Well, speaking of the good technology that is out there, tell me what Lexis might have on offer right now to support firms and team leaders, with these challenges. Are there any new sort of products or platforms that LexisNexis is offering at this stage?
So the great thing is we had sort of identified document drafting and sort of workflow around the production of documents as an area for improvement before the pandemic hit. So it was something we were already starting to think about. When the pandemic hit, that kind of accelerated things because all of a sudden there was a very immediate need for something to help people in that situation. So it kind of moved it up our priority list. So we've been working with some teams from sort of across the globe, which is the beauty of being a global organization. Our UK business and our development team in China has been helping us to look at a new product called Lexis Create. And that really is a sort of workflow support tool. Goes a little bit beyond just drafting. It enables users to do everything from setting up approval workflows for actually adding shared content to a firm-wide database. So you can really reuse other people's drafting wherever you are, be that in the office or if you're working from home. You can kind of see what other clauses people have been utilizing when drafting similar documents and decide to utilize that. If you've got some good drafting of your own, then you can, add that to the database too. So really collaborative, working together, sharing kind of knowledge, obviously helps more junior lawyers as well because they're getting exposed to the experience of other people within the team. And then that moves right through the sort of, proofreading steps where there's lots of efficiency gains to be made through to helping lawyers with that kind of end execution of documents, which, increasingly is being done digitally.
Lindsay, we were talking a little bit earlier in this conversation about the potential pitfalls of having so many tech platforms or products in front of you and having, feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of the different things you're supposed to be using. And so people might, want to revert to old ways. Why will the introduction or the onboarding of Lexis Create be something that that is useful moving forward, as opposed to simply adding to that burden? Does Lexis Create take away the need for some of those other tech platforms that law firms and team leaders might have?
Absolutely. And it was important for us not to create yet another platform that people had to use and had to go to. So what we've done is Lexis Create is available as an add-on to Word. We know that lawyers, regardless of what platforms they're using, everybody is spending at least part of their day in Word drafting things. So Create really just opens up within your existing Microsoft environment. And, you can expand it when you want to use it and then minimize it when you're sort of finished utilizing the features in there. It was also important for us to integrate that into our existing products without making that difficult for users. So from within Lexis Create, users are very easily able to jump into Lexis Advance and eventually will also be able to access their practical guidance content from within the tools. So we call it context switching, and it's, how many different clicks you're using to access different tools. We've worked really hard to minimize that to make sure you can get to what you need as quickly as possible. support.
Well, if integration is an urgent priority for law firms and for individual lawyers, it's good to know that LexisNexis is integrating right alongside them. So further to what we're just talking about there with Lexis Create, and how and why it's going to be so important moving forward. Do you and LexisNexis have a sense of what a successful law firm or a successful practitioner looks like in 2022 and beyond? In this sort of broader context and conversation about the need for better integration?
I think that as a successful lawyer looks like a lawyer who is spending the vast majority of their time actually doing law, so actually doing legal advisory work, interacting with their clients, really using their expertise and experience when they need to, and absolutely minimizing the amount of time they're spending on, efficiency draining tasks such as, drafting. So I think if there's anything you can do to really minimize the amount of potentially unbillable time that you're spending, pulling together a document, reviewing a document, sending it off to other people to kind of look at that document and give feedback, then that's going to make you much more successful, both from a profitability perspective and also just in the perspective of having more time to focus on the good work that you're actually able to do in an advisory capacity.
Absolutely. And I imagine that also, part of that success will come down to a certain amount of proactivity, in realizing that the new normal in a post-pandemic market is somewhat uncertain. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. We don't know how many lawyers might want to go back into the office versus stay at home versus having a hybrid working arrangement. And if those things are hard to predict, then one has to put themselves in the best possible position administratively in order to succeed and to better support their clients and their businesses.
Absolutely. The one thing we do know is that the legal marketplace is going to remain a very competitive environment. And if anything, that competition is only going to increase in the future. So now's a great time for firms to be sort of future-proofing that by looking at their internal systems.
Lindsay, it's been fascinating chatting to you about the need for urgent integration and why it's going to make one a better lawyer, why it's going to help your law firm. Do you have any other pearls of wisdom, any other arguments to make for these firms in order to, I suppose, more quickly realize the importance of integration?
Well, I just want to take a moment to look even further into the future. So I know we've talked a lot about firms kind of returning to the office potentially, in the next sort of few months in the next year. But looking beyond that, I think there's some really exciting things to come from the technology world. There's a lot being worked on out there by a number of different providers, which are going to really revolutionize a lot of the way that law is done currently. I think there's been historically a slight nervousness within the profession about concepts such as artificial intelligence and, machine learning. Certainly there is a reluctance perhaps now to rely on things like that due to concerns about accuracy or even the ethics of, some of those tools. But just to sort of give a sneak preview of some of the things we're thinking about, we're looking at these tools right now and how we can actually utilize them. One of the challenges with things like AI is it's a really exciting concept, but finding an actual real life user case that the legal market's going to be comfortable with can be quite challenging. So we're currently looking at sort of next generation Lexis Create, a sort of feature add-on that we're calling Clause Intelligence, which will really utilize artificial intelligence to actually suggest content to users. So going a step further than sort of proofreading and making your document accurate, what that will aim to do is actually to make your document even better by looking at what you're doing and then suggesting alternate drafting from the sort of extensive LexisNexis database. So there's a lot of exciting things, I think, to come even further down the line. Law firms potentially should be starting to think about that now and what their appetite for that kind of technology is, because I think people who adopt these kinds of tools at an early stage are going to have a big competitive advantage going forward.
Well, it's always good to have a little sneak preview of what's to come from you guys, and it certainly sounds exciting. Lindsay O'Connor, thank you so much for joining me on the show, and thank you to LexisNexis for partnering with us for yet another conversation.
Thanks for your time, Jerome. It's been an absolute pleasure to discuss this with you.
And thank you to the listener for tuning in. We hope you